Welcome, everyone. I'm Catherine Sickink, the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. We're going to be giving you just a few minutes here to wait for everyone to come in, and then we'll begin our event. Very nice. Okay. Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to the book launch for Professor Yanilda González's just published book. And here I'm going to hold it up, Authoritarian Politics and Democracy, Contested Security in Latin America. It's published by Cambridge University Press, and it just came out. So this is a very timely moment. Now, first, I want to thank the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. They are the co-sponsors of this book launch. And before we begin, the Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits is traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and a place that's long served as a gathering place and a meeting to have exchanges among nations. We at the Harvard Kennedy School feel really fortunate that Yanilda González has recently joined us as an assistant professor of public policy. She received her PhD from Princeton University, moved to the University of Chicago, but she has been a fellow at the Ash Center. So in some ways, we're welcoming her back to the Kennedy School. Her research focuses on policing, on state violence and citizenship and democracy, and examines in particular how race, class, and other forms of inequality shape these processes. Now, Professor González spent many years doing incredible field research in Latin America for this book. And so we're really in some ways celebrating the fruit of that research. So we're going to begin by having Professor González give us an overview of her book for about 15 minutes. And then we're extremely privileged to have two expert commentators on this issue. We first will have Vesla Weaver, who is the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. She's an expert on racial inequality and violence in the United States and has written multiple books on this topic. And then she'll be followed by Daniel Brinks. He's a professor of government and law and the chair of the government department of the University of Texas at Austin, and one of the leading researchers on judicial response to police violence in Latin America. So I can't imagine two better commentators on this book, and we're really happy that you can join us today. Each of them will have about approximately 10 minutes to discuss the book, and then we will open it up, and the last 15 to 20 minutes will be dedicated to answering questions from you, our public. And so I'm going to ask you to submit your questions at any point through the Q&A button here on your screen. And I'll be reading these as we go along. And as soon as the commentators finish their comments, I will offer your questions to Yanilda and to the commentators perhaps as well to respond. So I want to finally just say this event is being recorded and can be found later on the Ash Center website and on the YouTube channel after the event has concluded. So let's turn directly to Professor Yanilda González to provide an overview for us of her new book, Authoritarian Police in Democracy. Welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for Professor Sickink for that introduction. It's really such a great privilege to be able to be here with all of you today to sort of discuss my book, which, as Catherine mentioned, just came out last week with Cambridge University Press, and I feel deeply honored to be able to share this space and to be in conversation with two scholars, Daniel Brinks and Vesla Weaver, whose own work on policing, on the rule of law, on racial inequality have just deeply informed my understandings of these issues. And so just really what a treat and what a privilege to be able to be in conversation with them today. I'd also like to thank the Ash Center and the Carr Center for supporting this book launch and providing this virtual space for us all to gather here. So as Catherine mentioned, I wanted to just give a brief overview of the book and sort of situate it in this context that we're living through today. So of course, as many of you know, and perhaps you're here because you're deeply interested in policing, given the space that it has now come to occupy really around the world, as we're seeing truly a global outcry over questions of policing, right? Thinking from Nigeria, where we've been seeing massive protests and SARS movement, right, against a violent and predatory police unit that has its roots in a colonial past, and that has an act of violence, an emblematic act of violence that has led to mass street protests in rejection to not only a form of policing, but really a whole political system. Similarly, in Brazil, we've seen protests in recent months over the deaths of Black youth, such as Guilherme in Sao Paulo and João Pedro in Rio de Janeiro. Black teen boys from low-income communities brutalized at the hands of police, and leading to widespread protests against racial inequality and police violence. In Colombia, similarly, we saw in recent months mass mobilizations against the killings of young Black men like Anderson Arboleda in Puerto Tejada, under the guise of enforcing COVID measures, all the way to the brutal killing of Javier Ordóñez in Bogotá, which similarly has placed police violence at the center of the agenda there. In Chile, we've seen police violence take center stage in the context of a broader social unrest, and placing police reform on the agenda there, perhaps for the first time since the transition to democracy in Chile. And of course, right here in the US, we've seen recently, the largest protest movement in US history against racial injustice and police violence. So of course, and these are just a sampling, right, of sort of all the places where we've been seeing people rising up over questions of policing. And so really around the globe, we've been seeing this real outcry over police practices that run counter to democratic principles. But these protests are also broader than just the police. They refer to broader deficiencies in political institutions and social inequalities. And so these are two insights that are at the core of my book, which asks, why do we see the persistence of these types of violent, unaccountable police forces, and under what conditions do societal and political actors decide to undertake change? And at the same time, how do we situate these police forces within a broader structural, political, and social context? And so the book is very much informed by and seeks to inform these ongoing processes of social and political contestation over policing. The book begins with the observation that many police forces in Latin America, but certainly around the world, but my focus is in Latin America, maintain police practices and structures that are much more similar to what is described by scholars of police in authoritarian regimes than to what theories of democracy would lead us to expect about police forces in democratic regimes. And so in the book, I argue that we need to disaggregate regime type from how police forces operate in order to understand the persistence of what I call authoritarian police in otherwise standard democracies, right? That sort of political science would say they check the boxes for calling it a democracy. And so the book's main argument is that the persistence of authoritarian police can't be reduced simply to legacies of previous authoritarian regimes, nor can it be seen as an aberration of democracy or a failure of democratic processes. What I argue instead is that both the persistence of authoritarian police in democracy and reform efforts to move toward democratic policing are both the result of ordinary democratic politics. And I assess this argument through comparative analysis of police forces in Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia. And so I'd like to just go over three key aspects of the theoretical framework, provide a couple of snapshots of my empirical analysis, and then discuss some of the key takeaways from the book for some of the ongoing debates around policing here in the US and in Latin America and more broadly. So I first define a continuum between authoritarian coercion and democratic coercion that can insist in ways that don't correspond to the regime type. So we can have authoritarian coercion in democracies, and we can even have movements toward democratic policing or democratic coercion in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes as well. And this is based on the terrific work on police in authoritarian regimes by scholars like Brian Taylor, Sheena Greitens, and Pablo Politzer, among others. And I define authoritarian police based on these folks' great work. I define authoritarian police as those that exercise coercion to serve the interests of the leader, that is not bound by the rule of law, but is instead exercised in arbitrary or exceptional ways. And it is not subjected to external accountability. And this is really in contrast to what democratic theory would lead us to expect about the exercise of coercion or the act of policing, which is that it should be done in the interest of citizens, not leaders, and with citizens' input, that it should be based on the rule of law, and that it should be subjected to robust external accountability. And so the question that the book tackles is why democracies consistently sustain authoritarian police, and under what conditions can we see movement toward the democratic end of the spectrum? And so to begin answering this question, I proposed that we consider, and this is sort of one of the key theoretical elements of the book, that we have to consider the structural role of the police as the entity to which the state delegates its monopoly of the legitimate use of force. So just as Charles Lindblom argued for the sector that controls capital, I argue that the sector that controls coercion similarly plays an indispensable role for political leaders in democracies, and that because of this, police are able to extract important concessions from leaders in ways that constrain political agendas. So specifically, this control over security, order, use of force gives police considerable structural power. Such that it's a powerful political tool when police cooperate with you, and it's a considerable political threat when police are able to withdraw their cooperation with you as a politician. And so this structural power poses a problem for democracies because it actually favors the persistence of authoritarian police. So the use of control over the use of force is, as I said, a powerful political tool that incentivizes politicians to accommodate the police, exchanging police cooperation for giving them greater autonomy. And this, let me go back. The police being such a, the control of the use of force being such a powerful political tool incentivizes police to subordinate the interest of the interest of protecting citizens from crime to advancing their own political interests. And similarly, the use of force as the withdrawal of the use of force as a political threat incentivizes politicians to accommodate police, exchanging cooperation for autonomy, and weakening the possibility of external accountability. And both these conditions favor police actions that are arbitrary or exceptional. And so as a starting point, the police's structural power from the point of departure poses really important challenges and constraints on the political agenda and raises the threshold for any possible reforms. And so what the book also shows is that democratic processes themselves are not just kind of innocent bystanders in this, that they themselves can end up reinforcing authoritarian policing. And under some conditions, we can observe the emergence of an electoral counterweight to the police's structural power that can open up paths to reforms to promote democratic policing. And so I argue that both outcomes can be explained by looking to societal preferences and political competition, so that we can explain both the persistence of authoritarian policing and reform to promote democratic policing by looking to these two sort of ordinary elements of ordinary democratic politics. And so I analyze this argument by looking to the cases of, as I said, the three police forces, the military police of Sao Paulo in Brazil, the provincial police of Buenos Aires in Buenos Aires province in Argentina, and the Colombian national police. And so in the interest of time, I want to just give folks some of the empirical snapshots of sort of what I found in my fieldwork regarding both the elements of the use of the persistence of authoritarian police and the moments in which we see that shift from the political and social decision-making to shift from authoritarian policing toward democratic policing. So this was sort of before I was sort of organized enough and sort of developed enough as a scholar to even think about concepts and think about these things in any kind of theoretical way. I was really struck by the persistence of unequal racialized policing, and sort of already even as a very young person entering these settings, understanding that this was really antithetical to democracy. So one of the consistent findings of my fieldwork in particularly in the context of Brazil, which is what I'll talk about here in Sao Paulo, is simply this question of the extent to which policing does or does not conform itself to the rule of law. And I think that here, Bachelor Weaver's work on racial authoritarianism can really speak to this question, to sort of why policing that is so deeply racialized is so counter to the rule of law. And of course, Dan brings his work in Latin America, similarly showing inequality as such an important determinant of policing, why that's antithetical to the rule of law. And so what I found in police, my research in Sao Paulo, is sort of consistent elements of this racialization and of policing. So for example, victims of police killings in Sao Paulo, 2/3 of them are Black, in contrast to about the population as a whole, which is about 1/3 Black. It's a pattern that is deeply concentrated in young Black men from the urban periphery between the ages usually of 15 to 24. Police in Sao Paulo are not only sort of engaging in this sort of deeply racialized violence, but they're doing it at a very large scale. So they are responsible for the equivalent of 25 to 30% of all homicides in the state. And so these kinds of enduring practices, I found to be one of the key markers of authoritarian policing in the case of Sao Paulo. And it's one that I found in various ways throughout my fieldwork, whether it's coming across an official order from a local police commander in the city of Campinas, who indicated to his subordinates that in a particularly well-to-do area of Campinas, that they should focus their stops on Black and brown youth between the ages of 15 and 24. Or talking to a young police officer who said to me, look, when we're conducting stops, you could see a Black guy and a white guy walking, and the white guy could have stolen merchandise, but you're going to stop the Black guy, right? There's a sort of naturalization of this kind of racialized policing that runs counter to the very notion of the rule of law. And so this very important task of protecting citizens from crime in a particularly violent context is subordinated to these racialized practices that are contrary to the rule of law. Another element that I came across over and over again in my fieldwork was the reticence of civilian officials to hold police accountable. So I'll just give you two examples of sort of its most extreme manifestations, right? So in the case of Colombia, I interviewed the person within the equivalent of the Inspector General's office, who is charged specifically with investigating the police. And what he told me was, look, I don't think it's my job to interfere with the police's ability to do its job, right? Even though, like as that saying that folks are saying now, right? It's like, you had one job. And that one job is to hold the police accountable. And he sort of says, I think that would be, a bridge too far. And similarly, in the case of Sao Paulo, as I was looking at records of the state legislature's Commission on Security, whose job it is to provide oversight of policing, that they actually focus very little on these rampant waves of police violence that I mentioned. And instead they are focused on, they've called the ombudsman who has criticized police killings to testify before the committee more times than they've called the Secretary of Security to respond for these acts of police violence. So there's a real reticence of elected and appointed civilian officials to hold police accountable. So there's just two sort of empirical snapshots of the manifestations of this authoritarian policing that occurs in my field work. I'll hold off on the kind of politicization of coercion, just in the interest of time, but happy to address that in the Q&A. But the other piece I wanted to just mention is the role of politics and particularly societal preferences and demand making and political competition in driving decision-making about whether or not to reform the police. So in both the case of Colombia and the Colombian National Police and the Buenos Aires Police Province, I analyze in the book in very great detail how within the context of just a couple of months, decision makers shift from police reform being totally off the agenda to police reform being sort of at the very top of the agenda in response to shifts in these two political conditions. So in the case of Colombia, I process trace how a police reform bill that in September of 1992 was dead on arrival, and a process by which a political agenda, a consensus agenda between the two political parties had been developed that did not include police reform. Once we see mass societal mobilization in response to the rape and murder of a little girl in a police station, we then see the president shift gears in very short order. And then by the end of that month, setting up two reform commissions. And that same bill that had died in committee a few months earlier was fast-tracked and passed through the Congress. Similarly, in Buenos Aires province, we saw that the month before legislative elections, the governor had no intention to reform the police, and I go through the evidence for that in the book. But as soon as his party loses the legislative elections, we see that within a month, he was asking everybody, who has a police reform proposal? We're going to pass police reform right now, right? So it's something that is deeply responsive to political questions, to these political variables, and that depending on how the distribution of preferences looks and how political competition looks, politicians will either decide to sustain that status quo of authoritarian policing, or they will shift to democratic, so police reforms that will seek to promote democratic policing. And so I just wanted to sort of just say a couple of the takeaways I think that the book can hold, a couple of lessons for contemporary debates over policing. So the first takeaway that I hope people get from this is that current public debates around the problem of policing are woefully narrow. That often it focuses very much on, oh, is it a few bad apples, or is it, or just the kind of what we need to do is actually give police more money and more of this and more training. That really we need to see how police are embedded within this sort of structural, social, and political context if we are really to understand the nature of the problems that are driving this kind of unequal policing. We have to look at the electoral incentives of politicians. We have to look at how divisions and inequalities in society shapes the types of demands that people make of the police. And also that we have to contend with the police's structural power if any reform is actually going to take hold. And one of the things that I'd like to sort of put out there as a provocation to anybody in the audience is that one of the arguments that I've been making lately is about how the defund movement actually seeks to challenge this question of the structural power of police. So I'll stop my remarks there, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Daniel Brinks and Bachelet Weaver on this, as well as from all of you in the audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Yanilda González. And so now we're going to turn to the first commentator, once again, Bachelet Weaver, who is the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Johns Hopkins University and an expert on racial inequality and violence in the United States. Bachelet, thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me here and for creating the space to have this conversation about what is just a path-breaking, game-changing book. It's such a treat to be here and be a dialogue with you. This book literally has not left my mind since I first read it in draft form. And I have so much to say today, and there's so much rich that we can, explore and engage, but I want to focus my comments on what I find to be the biggest contributions, and give us some questions. I'm sure that there's some grad students and budding scholars in the audience, and really lay out some questions for future research and sort of, understanding where we ought to focus our attention going forward. As we sit here and discuss authoritarian policing, our nation faces reconciliation. Government's ability to protect its citizens has broken down in the cradle of democracy. Years of footage of state violence, police choking out citizens as they struggled for air, shooting unarmed citizens in the back or bed as they dreamed, dragging kids from suburban pools and slamming them, ending the lives of motorists as their 4-year-old children look on. Such dramatic and repeated examples of state violence were accompanied by vocal expressions of white supremacy in Charlottesville and beyond, police in combat gear raining down on protesters as they struggled for Black and brown liberation, and experiences of structural violence posed by a pandemic that exacted even more loss, in arguably the clearest depiction in decades of structural, systemic, and state violence in real time. They also displayed the power of the radical imagination in Black struggles to confront these violences by building new discourses, and Yanilda mentioned some of these, of well-being and justice and community responses to safety deprivation, the frameworks of the marginalized that inspired the solidaristic responses in every city and suburb in America and beyond. And finally, the fraying of the social compact has guided an urgent focus on how to improve democracy. Our moment demands new ideas for how we might reroute our approach so that the afterlives of police occupation do not retread the afterlives of slavery and Jim Crow in the US and the afterlife of military repression in Latin America, in the Latin American cases. Yet state violence and structural violence were paired with epistemic violence, a discounting of the people's knowledge, of the police's knowledge by mainstream academics and policymakers who often wrote and theorized and designed policy not from the perspective of those for whom domination was a core concern, but from the perspective of elite theories, and who continued to isolate questions of policing from democracy. And this is the signature contribution of this book. Yanilda González gives us a language and concepts and theory and cases to understand, as she puts it, why police forces in what are otherwise healthy democracies often exhibit sustained patterns of violence and corruption that are incompatible with democracy. Military dictatorships ended, but the disappearances and torture and executions remained prevalent, and particularly for those subjugated by race and class and by geography under democratic rule. And she shows us that not only are they compatible and persistent, but they're actually facilitated in important ways by democratic politics. Just as they were central to the machinery of repression under military rule, the police are also called in, justified, and key to democratic responsiveness in newer and longstanding democracies. And in doing this, she's illustrating for us, for the field, for policymakers, the disconnect between what is claimed in theories of democracy and what is actually realized. Coercive institutions and practices of state violence remain not despite democracy, but because of it. That's her biggest and really amazing argument. The book yields uncommon insights about the nature and staying power of authoritarian patterns of coercion in democracy. And she takes scholars inside the black box of police bureaucracies in Buenos Aires, in Sao Paulo, and in Colombia. And she delivers singular contributions to our understanding of why reforms succeed or fail to dismantle authoritarian policing. Authoritarian regimes and periods give birth to coercive structures and practices, but, to quote her, they have been subjected to reproduction and renewal through ordinary democratic politics. This argument has great staying power and it has legs. I would argue that it fits the United States too, even as scholars, including myself, has struggled to theorize this as authoritarian, as a form of authoritarian practice. Americans have shown themselves to be all too willing to turn to racially authoritarian practices to deal with crime and safety deprivation. The second major contribution is that in a field that has been quite slow to recognize police, right? Political science, we study power, we study instruments of the state, we study the relationship between citizens and their governing authorities. And yet we were slow to recognize police as political, as important and powerful political actors that can extend authoritarian practices into a democratic politics. She shows us the structural power of police. She shows us that they are key to the distribution of protection and repression. I wanted to, I'm not a Latin American scholar, and so I learned a great deal about the cases, but I hope you'll excuse me because I kept seeing places where I would say, oh my gosh, this is exactly the same in the United States. And yet it's easier, I think your argument is easier to be appreciated and swallowed by scholars who have studied, previously autocratic regimes, right? Because the United States, we're the cradle of democracy, right? We are the democratic ideal, right? We are the country that others are measured up against, right? We don't need election observers. We don't need, our police follow a constitution that, prescribes their actions. And yet, if we look to a bottom-up experience of democracy in highly policed communities in this country, we witness all of the features and some others that point to democratic disrepair. Broad criminalization of the community, including the law-abiding. Selective enforcement of the law is widely practiced such that one could say that we actually imbibe a dual legal system. Access to democratic freedoms, like the freedom to assemble, the freedom to move about, the freedom to come and go. Privacy is limited. State violence is routine and expected, and it's expected by children. I literally just read a transcript this morning where the child said, well, he's now an adult, but he was thinking back to his childhood and he said, well, yeah, we knew, we understood what a cavity search was, right? We understood what police could do to us. We understood our bodies were state property, right? Intensive surveillance permeates private space. Police retaliation is routine. Personal autonomy is limited. Adaptations to deflect police attention and incursions into home life are widely shared and understood and habituated at tender years of adolescence. The mundane understanding of police occupation, the systematic extraction of resources and predation that we saw in Ferguson and other localities. Compared to the more recent examples of democratic backsliding in the United States, these communities had long endured unofficial restrictions on movement, a press that contributed to their broad criminalization and criminal stigma. They had already experienced the regular violation of democratic norms. Unconstitutional police actions and illegal force were mostly not sanctioned or corrected. There was no accountability. They already felt that revelations of serious abuse were discounted and dismissed by the majority and by the press. And they understood that the Constitution would never fully guard against authoritarian policing practices. Indeed, the Constitution, in restricting the worst abuses, has become a safeguard of a softer tormenting of democratic freedoms. Yanilda, you mentioned this concept that I've been developing based on, largely on your book's arguments, called racial authoritarianism. And I would argue that racial authoritarianism is a longstanding and perhaps the most extensive tradition and institutional arrangement within American democracy. Just as clientelism, corruption, election rigging are key indicators abroad, so too should we begin to theorize and measure racial oppression as a key indicator of the extent of democracy here, just as exclusion and disenfranchisement and distrust in institutions and civic erosion are indicators of democratic backsliding and disrepair today, so too should racial authoritarianism be seen as a challenge to democratic health. Authoritarian policing practices subvert democracy, even while being compatible with it. That is one of your book's key lasting claims. My question to us and to future scholars is, how can we think about practices that don't necessarily violate the Constitution, but that most would agree are not democratic? How ought we measure democracy and get away from conventional measurements that tend to obscure or tend to have a very narrow understanding that as long as you have free and fair elections, as long as you don't have an executive grabbing power and packing the bureaucracy with loyalists, as long as you have some modicum of representation and responsiveness to the people, as long as citizens' legitimacy in institutions is relatively high, why is it that we, or ought we not also look to the extensiveness of repression and coercion and police violence as ways that democracy also suffers? Can we think of and begin to theorize varieties of democracy along different indicators that would include what your book shows us as being central to policing and authoritarian practices within policing? Can we, as Michael Hanchard says, recouple anti-democratic rule and democratic freedom in our theorization and measurement of democracy? I was reading an old book by on repression.
I'm going to have to cut you off here because otherwise we're not going to have time for Q&A. Thank you so much, Vesla Weaver. And we're going to turn now to Daniel Brinks, our second commentator. He is the professor of government and of law and the chair of the government department of the University of Texas, Austin, and a leading researcher in judicial response to police violence in Latin America. Daniel, turn to you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to Yanilda for giving me the chance to reread her book and to talk about the book again. It's always a pleasure, and I really enjoyed Vesla's comments as well. I think in some ways, my comments are going to track with hers a little bit, which is not surprising because I think there's some things that really jump out at you from Yanilda's book, and Vesla's really kind of pointed those out. So it's not obvious to many people, but I was born in Argentina and I grew up in Argentina, and I left Argentina sort of halfway through the last dictatorship there. And you know, in my high school years when we were going out and doing things at night, you know, the only people we were really afraid of were the police and the military, right? People wearing a state uniform and people who are, you know, nostalgic for those days, I think have forgotten just how much we feared the state and people in state uniforms. We really did grow up afraid of the police. And so, you know, looking back at those democracies, some years after the transition, you know, in the 80s, it was shocking to me to see just how much state violence had survived the transition, just how much, you know, the state had maybe shifted its focus to its political opponents, or from its political opponents to a new class of targets. But that state violence was really very much present, and it always makes me think when I look at that, it always makes me think, you know, of Amartya Sen's old argument already from the 70s and early 80s that linking democracy in the absence of famines, you know, arguing that, you know, democracies don't have famines because in the presence of a free press and a contestatory public and competition, you know, the state is just going to respond to these sort of mass catastrophes, right? And that to me really points out the really big puzzle in the continuance of state repression and violent policing in democracies, right? How is it that our politics, that our society tolerates, reproduces, even encourages year after year after year, the killing of thousands of young men, many of them, in a way, really far removed from the things that people think they're concerned about, right? People think they're worried about violent criminals and rapists. And, they use this kind of language to describe the victims of police violence when really the victims are more marked by their race, by their class, right? By their position in society. And to me, this really points to a structural problem in our democracies that disconnects, right, the public's response from the tragedy that's happening every year. And that's what I think is so valuable about your book, right? It really does kind of focus in on this puzzle of violent policing. Too much of our research, too many of our debates really get sort of focused on the operational puzzle, right? And they get focused on the immediate solutions, right? Like, how can we train the police better? How can we provide more, alternative interventions, whatever? And to me, that in some ways obscures the fundamental political puzzle that your book it really tackles, right? So I think that is the basic question for us as citizens in a democracy, for us as scholars of democracy, people who are concerned with the continuation of repressive authoritarian policing in democracies, not just in the Southern Cone or in South America, but all the way up here, and as Vesla said, in the cradle of democracy. So that's the question, right? What are the political conditions that allow the response to what is obviously a serious problem, violence and crime, the sense of insecurity that often the very same people who are targeted by the police are feeling, that allow the solution to that problem to be the daily systematic violence against a group of individuals, poor urban youth often, that in many instances have little to do with the real causes of the problem. So the first issue I wanted to raise, it has to do with one of the big sort of core elements of your argument, right? You talk a lot about sort of fragmented political public opinion and sort of these conflicting feelings in civil society or in society generally, right? Between wanting security, wanting less violent policing, wanting police accountability, but nothing that, so there's no consensus around that. And that's a little bit reminiscent of some of the sort of uncivil society arguments that we heard right after the transition, that you can't expect civil democracies if you have an uncivil society. So, your argument's more interesting than that, and I think more accurate. But what doesn't appear very much in your book is something we've seen really visibly in the last election, which is more of a top-down leadership decision to exploit this fragmentation, these conflicting feelings around policing and security and crime, and to really use those issues as a wedge issue. I think Bolsonaro did that really well. I think in our last election we saw it as well, right? And so that's sort of my first provocation, if you will, right? To what extent do you really see this as mostly a bottom-up problem, and to what extent do you really see leaders who see this ambivalence in society and exploit it for their own political benefit? The second thing that I think is really interesting, which Vesla mentioned, she called it the police as political actors, and that's also what strikes me in your argument, right? And a lot of policy problems don't have a political actor as its target. Some of them do, but not all of them, right? And what's interesting about the police as a political actor in these issues is that they can sort of create negative policy feedbacks, right? So and we see this in really dramatic fashion in Buenos Aires, in Sao Paulo, where the police don't just create a feeling of insecurity through rhetoric, but through actual sort of promoting and permitting crime waves and working with the criminals to really create negative feedback effects from reform attempts, right? And in your story, I think rightly, the police is primarily interested in pushing back and preserving its autonomy, in continuing to operate unaccountably and so on. But every once in a while, I run into some police people who are not like that, right? And there was a really interesting police official from Sao Paulo at UT taking classes at the LBJ School of Public Policy, right? Working hard to develop new theories of community policing and engaged policing and democratic policing and all that sort of thing, right? And so I guess at some point, and maybe this is, too much of a pipe dream, but at what point is it possible for you to imagine, or what would it take for you to think of the police as someone who actually is, as an entity, as an actor, as an institution, that is actually interested in more democratic policing, right? Through, I don't know, professionalization, or through socialization, or through, I don't know, and I don't mean through like external accountability mechanisms like civilian oversight or whatever, but something that's truly driven from below. The last thing I just...
Okay, you know what, Dan? Now
okay.
I'm going to cut you off too, because we have only 10 minutes to go, and we've got questions in the chat. And so I'm going to turn to questions in the Q&A, but also we have one in the chat in these last minutes. We have a question here from Stephen Sterrett, and he asks about the importance of social media. And he calls it gatekeeper-less social media. Can it be a constraint on abusive policing authority in your case studies, Yanilda González? And also, has large-scale protests had an impact? To you, Yanilda.
Yes, of course. And I also would love for Dan and Vashla to weigh in as well, if they have anything to add. I mean, I think that one of the things that that I argue in the book is that scandals are really important moments for leading to a convergence of societal preferences and demands around police reform. And I think that things like social media do facilitate the kind of occurrence of a scandal, but they're not determinative. They're not sort of it's not a sort of a guarantee that they will. I think that we've seen case after case after case of brutal acts of violence caught on video that sort of fail to rise to the top of the agenda, right? So we can think about the case of Michael Brown in Ferguson, where there was no video, to the case of John Crawford III in Ohio, which happened around the same time, killed in a Walmart as he was talking to to the mother of his child, because he was carrying around a toy gun, right? And so the kind of availability of different kinds of media, from videos to other kinds, are not a guarantee that something will become a scandal that generates that kind of broad-based social mobilization in favor of reform. Now, the question was specifically about social media, which I think speaks to more about the kind of mobilization, the ability to sort of mobilize people on social media, perhaps, and not necessarily just finding out about different acts of police violence. Because one of the other things that has occurred is a kind of saturation of these videos and whatnot. And so one thing that I would sort of ask as a researcher is sort of, do we see a greater likelihood of any one of these videos becoming coming to generate that kind of a scandal, or do we see people beginning to normalize it? Because I think that the reason I asked this is specifically thinking about Brazil. One of the very few police violence scandals that occurred in Brazil was in the late 1990s in response to videos of police violence in the city of Diadema. and this was kind of one of the first times that people saw police engaging firsthand in these, sort of people who don't live in the what Bachelor calls race, class, subjugated communities, saw for the first time these acts of police violence on their screens. But as these videos have become more and more common on social media in Sao Paulo, you kind of, see a lot less of any kind of reaction to them. And so it's sort of answering your question with a question, which is, have we seen a greater incidence of these scandals as a result of these videos coming on social media? And I'm not sure that that's the case. I think, I think that it's a very powerful tool that does sort of democratize the possibility that people who have been subjected to police violence and police abuses can kind of make them known. But sort of how will broader society react, I think, is and can it overcome those divisions, that fragmentation that exists in society? I think that would be sort of my my response to that. Sort of my other point to that would be sort of to point to Dan's work on police killings, which is that mobilization around particular cases, some of which can definitely be prompted by social media, do make it more likely that you see a conviction in the case of officers who have killed someone. And so it's possible that through generating social pressures, social media perhaps can lead us toward greater accountability of cases of police killings. That's another sort of open question that I think we'll have to sort of see in the coming years, sort of how that, whether Dan's argument from the 90s, sort of holds in the case of social media today.
Okay. And we have a question here from Luis Fernandez, and it's about Mexico. But before I give it, I want to just tell people that you can still get a question in. So if you have a question, get it into our Q&A, and there still will be time for, I think, one more question after this. So, and Luis Fernandez says, in Mexico, we created the Guardia Nacional. It was a form of national police that was supposed to be independent from the military. But that even so, the Guardia Nacional is controlled by the military. And what would you advise, Yanilda, to González, to avoid authoritarian acts by the national police?
Thank you for that question. Sort of, it's always interesting to think about the Mexican case as one, where it is so salient because of the sort of, on the one hand, very high levels of violence that are going on there and that very much need to be addressed, but where police forces have continued to engage in, again, these authoritarian practices. And the national police, the Guardia Nacional, is a really interesting one because it's one that was, sort of created by a leftist government that sort of was promising a different model. And so I, without being sort of an expert on Mexico, I would say that one of the things that we ought to look for is to what extent does that Guardia Nacional respond to the needs of and interests of citizens and protecting them from that rampant crime and violence, and to what extent are they serving the political interests of the leader that created them? And I think that there is some evidence for a kind of politicization at the hands of sort of political interests. And so we have to sort of wonder whether that kind of authoritarian policing has already begun. And I know that there are also some prominent cases of violence at the hands of the Guardia Nacional. And so it'll be, I think, interesting to see in the coming years whether this is a police force that can tackle sort of Mexico's sprawling drug war and violence in a different way than the traditional police actors. Is it really a way that breaks the political ties that we know have led to strong acts of authoritarian policing? Of course, the case of the 43 disappeared students in Ayotzinapa is but one example. The one of the most egregious, of course, but that's kind of the pending question for Mexico. It's sort of one danger of a national police force in a context like the drug war is that it is very much prone to control by the executive and could devolve into acts of authoritarian acts of violence that then are not held accountable because that executive is so deeply linked to the police force. So again, sort of answering your question with more questions, that's a thing I'm very good at, but I would say that that's kind of would be the extension of my book's argument to the case of the Guardia Nacional in Mexico.
So our time's almost up, but with just one last question. One of the powerful things about your book is that it says that reform is possible under certain conditions, right? And so does your model about mobilization and political competition leading to police reform in some cities in Latin America offer any hope for police reform in the US today, or perhaps in some cities in the US today?
Yeah, and I can tie that question also to Dan's provocation about aren't there some police officers who are also looking for a different way? And I think that what I found in I sort of mentioned that the very narrow way that police reform had been thought about in the US, at least by mainstream actors, like in the post-Ferguson era in particular, body cameras, implicit bias trainings, crisis intervention trainings, sort of things like that, and the need to think more broadly. And I would say that the cases that I study that successfully enacted police reform, passed reform legislation, they looked at every element of policing, from hiring to promotions to education to decentralization, demilitarization, every abolishing of certain units, sort of everything was on the table at the time of police reform, which is really how it should happen, because this needs to be a problem that is thought about in a comprehensive way. But the kind of thing that's not in the book and is a separate separate paper that I'm writing is the aftermath and how police exercise their structural power to roll back those reforms. And so what we end up with is that all of the reforms that do entail external accountability, that do entail any kind of sort of structural changes to police, are rolled back, and those that are favored are more operational ones, like community policing, like let's keep human rights education, let's do professionalization of police. And so what Dan mentioned was sort of this middle ground that I have found where police, these sort of internal actors that do wish to see a different kind of police force, do succeed in implementing these kind of professionalizing and community policing oriented types of reforms, but that those end up being quite limited, and you still see very high rates of police violence, and Sao Paulo, chief among them, but the Colombian police as well, of police violence that becomes even harder for societal and political actors to control. And so I think that my book sort of leaves us all in a very pessimistic place, but I think a more realistic one about what is possible with policing. And I think that this is where this question of thinking about the structural role of police is really important, because we increasingly have in our societies police involved in schooling, in handling mental health, in enforcing COVID measures. They take on so many different roles that then gives them ever more leverage over politicians and societies, that I think complicates the project of police reform and democratic policing. And so I think that is sort of, I don't know if it's hopeful, but it's at least an avenue that to thinking about police reform, that if it's going to be possible, attacking that structural role of the structural power of police is going to have to be central to any project of police reform, if that reform is going to endure.
Well, those seem like, I was going to ask for final remarks, but it seems to me you just wrapped it all up there with those final remarks. So I want to thank Yanilda González very much for this amazing new book from Cambridge University Press. It should be available already or very soon through your bookstores. There, Vesla's holding up her copy of it for people to purchase and read. I also want to greatly thank Vesla Weaver and Daniel Brinks, two really leading experts in this field, for your time and your thoughtful remarks, and I've seen that this is not just this moment, but that Professor González has benefited from your remarks for a longer period of time as she's worked on this book, and that there's a mutual exchange going on here among you. So that was a pleasure to hear about. I want to thank the Ash Center and the Carr Center for hosting this event. There are a few comments in the chat that I hope we can save so that Yanilda González can take a look at them when she finishes this. So thanks to everybody, and I'm going to turn it over to James or to Melissa, who will wrap up our meeting.